Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli joins us now from Washington, D.C. with the key voice on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Yes, we're here with Senator Angus King. He is with us, an independent from Maine, with us in studio. So thrilled to have you here with us. And we're talking so much about the U.S. and China, and one of the issues that comes up frequently is the issue of cybersecurity. And you've actually just you've been working very hard on this, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. What would it do, and how would it impact companies like Huawei?
Well, the underlying purpose, and this is a commission that was created by the National Defense Act last year, the underlying purpose is to define and develop a national strategy and doctrine on cyber, which we don't have. We've got the authorities scattered throughout the government. There's no clear definition of what a cyber attack is, what the response ought to be, and right now we're a cheap date. We're subject to cyber attacks. Very little, if any, response. There's no deterrent, in other words. So this is a commission that was set up, as I say, under law, with 4 members of Congress, I think 4 or 5 members of the executive branch, and then private sector. Very high-powered group. We've met, I think, now 3 times. We're sort of in the early stages. But the idea is to try to move us toward a government-wide doctrine that will help protect us, because this is the #1 threat.
Yeah.
This is it. The next Pearl Harbor will likely be cyber.
And so what I find interesting, though, is that as so many over the past decade in particular, there's this apprehensiveness in the private sector for headline risk, for shareholders in particular, when there is a hack or a data breach, for example, that if you report it, you're held negatively accountable. So how do you strike that balance, both domestically but also geopolitically, again, with companies like Huawei?
Well, I wish I could give you a clear and definitive answer, but that's one of the complications about this. This isn't just defending, military bases. It's defending Sony Pictures or Anthem, Blue Cross, or the financial sector, electrical sector. So developing a relationship between the federal government and the private sector is part of our challenge. That's why we have private sector people. One of our leading members on the commission is a guy named Tom Fanning, who's the CEO of the Southern Company, utility company in the South, very forward-looking on these issues. And this is a hugely, most of the cyber attacks come on the private sector. I've talked to one company CEO whose company gets attacked 3 million times a day. Wow. And I've talked to small banks that are getting attacked 100,000 times a day. So this is not just a government problem.
Senator, just on the China trade dispute, China has obviously named its price now. I'm curious if you think the president's approach is a good approach. Do you back that approach?
Well, first, I back the president's confrontation of China on a number of these issues, particularly about intellectual property. I think the president's playing a high-stakes game, however. It's sort of the shock and awe of trade policy, where, high tariffs imposed unilaterally. And I thought, I think you mentioned, or your reporter mentioned, that he's saying, well, they shouldn't retaliate. Well, that's what happens in a trade war. People retaliate. I mean, that's night follows day, and this is a high-stakes game. Now, he may be successful. I think we have to allow that if China folds and makes some serious concessions on intellectual property and other issues, then he will have been successful. I'm skeptical, however. I think he's put him in a position where he's trying to force structural changes in the Chinese economy, which I think will be it'll be surprising if they make those kinds of concessions. I can see them agreeing to buy more soybeans, or kind of transactional parts of this, but the more structural pieces, state-owned enterprises, I think that's going to be very hard. And he's raised the stakes to the point where it's going to be. I think it's a high stakes and I think a dangerous game right now, and it's going to directly affect the U.S. economy. This idea that the Chinese pay the tariffs, American consumers are going to pay the tariffs. Larry Kudlow pretty much conceded that yesterday on American television. Consumers are going to pay the tariffs. It's a tax on a lot of consumer goods, $600 billion, $200 billion coming in, and it's affecting, and the retaliation is affecting all kinds of sectors. I'll give you one example.
Yes.
Lobsters from Maine. Exporting lobsters from Maine to China, which is a major one of our markets we've worked for years to develop, is now virtually dead because of the retaliatory tariffs of the Chinese. So this is it's, as I say, high stakes, possibly will be successful, but I think the president has gone about it in a pretty heavy-handed way.
Let's pivot for a moment to the Attorney General. Are you satisfied, Senator, with the job Bill Barr is doing?
No. I don't. I think he misrepresented the Mueller report, both in his summary letter that he submitted to the Congress and then in his regrettable press conference as he introduced the report. He should have allowed it to speak for itself. And I don't, you know, I think it's the dispute about the Attorney General, I think, is somewhat of a distraction. I think we should be focused more on the underlying issue of what the Russians did, how they did it, and how we can respond and be sure they don't do it again. But I have been disappointed in Mr. Barr. I think he turned more into the president's lawyer than the country's lawyer.
Well, let me pick up where Vani just left off. I mean, specifically with where Russia should go next or how the U.S. should respond. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is going to be meeting with top Russian officials in the next 24 hours or so. What should his message be from the U.S. perspective to the Russians as we attempt to grapple with many geopolitical issues such as Venezuela?
His first sentence should be, lay off American democracy or you're going to pay a price.
What about Venezuela?
Venezuela, I think that's an area where we ought to be discussing. We ought to say, are you, I mean, the president has said they're not a malign actor in Venezuela. Other people have said that they are, but I think that's an area where the two countries, maybe they can find some resolution. They can get Maduro out in a period of time and restore some semblance of democracy. But I don't think Russia is a force for good in Venezuela right now. But I'd start with the attack on democracy that took place in 2016. And unfortunately, the president had a call with President Putin last week and apparently didn't raise that issue. And that's the #1 issue that I have with Russia right now.
You know, we're talking about Russia. We started the issue with the Cyberspace Delirium Commission that you are so crucial on and helping to develop. As you stare down the 2020 presidential election cycle, are Americans and American democratic institutions safer than they were in the 2016 cycle?
Marginally. I think our certain parts of the American government were better in 2018. They were more forward-leaning, and I think diverted some of the attacks in 2018. Whether that will happen, I mean, we were pretty much defenseless in 16. I mean, nobody really saw that coming until the summer, the spring and summer of 2016. I think now we're certainly more alert to it, but it would help if the President of the United States acknowledged that there's a problem here. Elements of the government who I work with are, in fact, taking it seriously and working on trying to defend ourselves. But here's the problem. I've talked to people around the world who are dealing with this kind of Russian interference. The best defense is for the people to know it's happening. In other words, they get some nonsense, you know, over the internet, and they say, oh, it's just the Russians again. And our president is denying that, and a lot of people in America think there's no such thing, and that's hurting our ability to resist.
Our thanks. We have to leave it there, Senator. To you, Senator Angus King of Maine, and of course our Chief Washington Correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, as always.